with great pleasure that I'm introducing Dr. Amanda Phillips, who I don't actually think needs any introduction because she's already spoken to both the Royal Asiatic Society in 2009 and to the Islamic Arts Circle in 2014, when she was still this side of the pond, as it were. But anyway, Amanda earned her DPhil at the Khalidi Research Centre for Islamic Art and Material Culture at Oxford. And she has held postdocs at both the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin and the Centre for Byzantine, Ottoman and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham. She is now assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the US. And in the UK, her work has been supported by the Passold Foundation and the Barakat Trust, and by the British Academy Fellowship at the University of St Andrews. Her first book, Everyday Luxuries, was about Ottoman material culture from spoons to silks, covering a broad range. But this, her second book, which brings us all together this evening, entitled Sea Change, Ottoman Textiles Between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, provides us with tonight's topic. And this, she assures me she's going to talk mainly about textiles. Sadly, the book is still not available yet in England, but the publishers have assured us that it should be here by the 23rd of June. So do take advantage of the generous discount they've given us on the flyer you will have already received. I think just as a bit of admin, if you've, or Alison will host the chats at the end, but please, if you have a question, just write in the chat box as and when as you go through the talk. Anyway, it's great pleasure that we turn the floor over to Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm spotlighted. I'm going to share my screen and make it big. So I'll take a minute thumbs up that you can see it, I hope. So again, thanks to Rosalind for the introduction. It's true, I was at the Islamic Art Circle, I think 7 years ago at the Khalili Lecture Theatre, and in fact to a much smaller audience. So yay Zoom, and thank you all for coming. And thanks Alison, thanks also to Alison for the invitation, the venue at RAS, and to Maddie Bradley for keeping us all organized and under control on Zoom. That said, to all my family in the audience, behave yourselves. So what I'll do this evening is talk about a couple of main themes from the book and also introduce some of the objects. You'll be glad to know I won't try to cover all 80 of the things in there, but I'll treat really just a few somewhat in depth. So you'll know already from the title that the book is about textiles in the Ottoman Empire. And a little background for those of you who aren't total specialists. This map seen here shows the expansion of the empire through the decades and centuries. So Constantinople or Istanbul as the capital, but territories from Algiers to Belgrade, south also to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Now, this map we see here also reflects more or less how histories of Ottoman art have been written. They tend to focus on centers of production in and around the capital, looking especially at palace workshops, fair play, right? Ceramics, silks, metalwork, art and other media, all in service to the Sultan. The map is also somewhat oriented west. We get all of Italy and Iberia, while a chunk of Arabia is omitted, and also most of the neighboring territories of Iran and Iraq, and certainly the Indian Ocean and India as well. The map, obviously, right, responds to the priorities of Encyclopedia Britannica and its English language readers. It also reflects, I think not inadvertently, another preoccupation of Ottoman art and architectural history, the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Renaissance Italy, and perhaps Europe more sort of more largely. And really, there have been a number of books and exhibitions on this topic over the past 30 odd years, right up into 2020. So far, so big. And here is a way of saying, yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, the relationship between Europe and the Ottoman Empire is important. It's undeniable for textiles. The visual and the technical link between Italian luxury velvets and their Ottoman counterparts are just so clear. Crimson and gold, bold motifs, some classicizing elements even. So very Renaissance. And more on this in a bit. This, by contrast, is a map my colleague Dan Weiss made for the book. It includes major textile producing centers outside Constantinople. So these are Tokat, Ankara, Salonika, also Aleppo, Damascus, several towns in Egypt. The map does reflect my shift east, bringing in centers in Iran and Iraq and India especially, which exported major quantities of textiles to the Ottoman Empire. And it's the Indian fabrics which would drive change in the 18th century, a topic I'll cover toward the end of the talk. So much, so expansive, and all now, I think now turning to chronologies. So let's start, in fact, with one of the book's superstar pieces. And for this, I'm going to point out, if I can do this with my mouse, it's covered by my Zoom tab, but look at Belgrade here. We're actually going to talk about a monastery about 200 kilometers to the south, and this is Studenica. So at Studenica is the Olivera silk. It's a massive textile with inscriptions that name the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I. The textile arrived at the monastery probably in the 1410s. The monastery's inventory records state that it was donated there by Sultan Bayezid's widow, a Serbian princess named Mileva Olivera. Inscriptions. So, art historians love objects with any kind of text because they appear to say so much. In this case, that the textile was made in honor of Sultan Bayezid. In this slide, we see the upper detail. We have a phrase, it's generic, referring simply to a wise and just sultan. The lower phrase, however, names Bayezid and wishes him glorious victories. The inscriptions are in Arabic, which is normal for this kind of imprecation, even though Bayezid himself would have spoken some kind of Anatolian Turkish. Now, a little more on context here. The Studenica silk is the earliest surviving Ottoman textile, full stop. It is the earliest piece of art associated with the Ottoman Empire, full stop. It's one of the very few textiles from the medieval Eastern Mediterranean that survives intact. It hasn't been cut down, nor is it a pastiche created out of other multiple objects. And we can see this from looking at the end finishes. So that's the upper detail. They're carefully designed to bracket the rest of the main field. And we can tell this too from the edges of the main field. This is actually made of 6 pieces. The main field preserves its selvages. So it's really big, by the way. So this is the only Ottoman textile also in this style and with this kind of inscription. So a unicum in several ways. So coming back to these inscriptions, if we look a little more carefully at them, but sort of think beyond semantic content, there are several features here that complicate our ideas about who it was made for or who ordered it and how. So look at the generic blessing in the upper image. Check out the script, right? I think you can see my mouse. It's fairly evenly spaced. It's typical in that it dislocates a couple of letters to sort of an upper register above the main text. Note also too that the uprights on the letters use little serifs at the same time, these little sort of caps or flags on the letters. But then if you compare the lower inscription, this is the one that names Bayezid, the writing is actually smushed, sort of, especially toward the end of the phrase, right? The whole word is squeezed into an upper corner. Also, no serifs, none of those little flags on the upright. Also, if we compare the tod in the word sultan, this sort of loop form here and here, we see that they're drawn differently. So hold this thought. In terms of structure, Bayezid silk is part of a large textile category known as figured compound weaves. Figured compound weaves are woven on really big looms equipped with patterning harnesses. These are machines and devices which at this point, around 1400, are widespread across Eurasia. So this is the part of the talk that I usually get into the nitty-gritty of weaving technology about how all the crossings of the warps, the multiple warps and the multiple wefts make the motifs and how all of this was worked out ahead of time. So for non-specialists, this becomes tedious pretty quickly. So instead, I'll give a précis. We can get into the nitty-gritty later if you want. It's enough here, I think, to say that the Studenitsa silk was made on a loom with a patterning device that was set up ahead of time and then operated to create these repeating bands of motifs. Setting up the loom and the device requires immense expertise as well as time, weeks for the setup, months to weave. So speaking of the repeats, note that the repeats within each band are the same length. So on the horizontal dimensions of these motifs within the bands cannot be altered without changing the whole loom setup. However, because of the sequential nature of weaving, the direction of work, the bands themselves, all the way across, could be swapped in and out at will, even during weaving, without altering the setup. The reason that the phrase naming Bayezid doesn't fit in is because it was forced to fit, right? It is not elegant. It had to fit those same horizontal dimensions. But that was tough. Note in the Arabic, also in the transliteration, that the phrase is actually much longer. It would have to be squeezed into the same space that fit the generic phrase. So what close looking at the object shows us is that the Bayezid inscription was a late addition to the loom setup. It was an interpolation into an existing set of bands, and it had to conform poorly to the dimensions within the bands that were already ready to go. Also, pretty clearly, a different calligrapher or designer for the Bayezid phrase. It doesn't match so well. The earlier phrase, the writing is somewhat different. So the interpolation of this band with the phrase obviates the need to create a whole new design. It obviates the need to remount the loom. So this is a huge savings in time. So why was that necessary? Was it expedited in honor of an event, perhaps a marriage, a victory, a new alliance? In the aftermath of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, Bayezid becomes Sultan. He seals the alliance with the Serbian kingdom and marries Olivera. Was it for this? In all cases, speculation aside, it was some kind of a rush job. And here we have royal prestige somewhat undermined by pragmatism. The object shows us something else. So this band of cloud forms or cloud bands, these come from Chinese art, arriving in the Mediterranean as filtered through Mongol, Central Asia, and Iran. There's a second set of these that are also an interpolation. And note, look at these carefully, right? The interpolated ones with the blue, they're actually really well drawn. The designer hewed pretty closely to the original. So this shows us something else too. Taken as a whole, it shows us that the workshop had a competent designer, right? Hence these cloud bands, but the calligrapher a little bit less so. The workshop also had access to really high quality silk and gold thread with a high proportion of precious metal. And this textile is still glittery after more than about 600 years. So good drawing, great materials, complicated weave structures, but not such accomplished calligraphy. A bit curious. So maybe woven then in an Ottoman city, at this point, still on a frontier of the Islamic world. So a corollary point that I'll make here while this slide is up, I'll leave it mostly aside though, that this textile or this image also illustrates all the labor that's involved in making it. So people raising silkworms, reeling and dyeing and twisting silk filament, making the gold foil wrapped thread, also a designer, weaver, weaver's assistant. You can take it back to building the loom and mining for the gold and silver even. So textile production is a huge part of any economy. As commodities, textiles were traded only in smaller quantities than grain. So this is big business. And speaking of labor, and before I leave this textile entirely, I would like to thank my colleagues in Serbia who made it possible for me to examine it. Also to get great photographs, that's Branko Strugar there, working really hard in perhaps an unideal setup. And I had so much help with this, right? From the abbot of the monastery giving permission, but also the National Museum in Belgrade, the Serbian Cultural Patrimony Agency, the museum in Kraljevo nearby, also the Serbian Patriarch and the Metropolitan of the Eastern United States, where I live and work, for making the introduction to. So I was really fortunate with this too, to have funding from the British Academy. Labor. So continuing with this and moving on to other kinds of Ottoman textiles, the Studenica silk may have been made in an Ottoman city, but working there were people who came from the Morea in Greece, from Iran, from the old Armenian kingdom in Cilicia, from Aleppo and Damascus, and from Italy too. They mixed with local expertises and created more. And this phenomenon repeats itself over the centuries. Changes in complex technology are most often introduced by the migration of artisans. And as seen in this really sophisticated graphic, the next known Ottoman silks use different weave structures. They represent new technologies introduced by court of artisans arriving in the empire from elsewhere. By contrast, changes in style, represented by the kinda arrow, changes in style work a little bit differently. Style may be imitated, emulated, elaborated upon, something I'll come to in a bit. So I'd now like to focus on velvets, and specifically on a type of silk and gold velvet known as chatma in the Ottoman sources. Chatma was often woven in this particular format. It's a type of cushion cover. As a type, chatma cushion covers were woven over centuries, and there are thousands of these that survive. And this was in fact the focus of my dissertation. So that's about 100,000 words on upholstery, which was, I think, possibly a first at the Oriental Institute or perhaps anywhere. The chatma cushion cover type makes for an interesting study because it's possible to connect them, the type at least, to historical terminology. So this in turn allows us to use written sources to understand their production. Written sources indeed show that many of them were made in workshops in the city of Borsa. By 1500, Borsa is a main center really for weaving of all kinds and for silk especially. Inventory lists for shops, estates, recorded disputes about weaving practice, the registration of goods as parts of dowries or for sale, even items that are burgled from residences or caravans. All of these give us glimpses into sort of ways to understand chatma making, trade, and consumption. Now, art historians also get really excited about written sources, and especially those that address processes of making. So among these are standards for chatma weaving that are registered at Bursa's Sharia courts. Think of this sort of as a type of self-imposed quality control. The standards from around 1600 demand that for the chatma cushion cover type, the thread be all silk, and specifically a kind of silk coming from the southern shore of the Caspian, that the silk be dyed with kermes, insect dye, that the silver and gilt threads use a certain amount of metal, that the weavers use a certain number of threads per measure, and also that the cushion covers be of certain dimensions. But the objects themselves really show us something totally different. The dyes are made from roots and sometimes from a tropical hardwood from Southeast Asia, which faded when exposed to light. Most of the interior wefts are cotton. Once in a while, wire was substituted for the gilt thread. Also in the gilt or gold thread, it might not be tightly wrapped, and the amount of precious metal may also be less than allowed. Some of the silk is of inferior quality, and also the thread counts can be quite low. So no rule left unbroken. The objects give lie to the documents that are meant to describe them. So in the absence of high quality silk during shortages in times where metal or dye stuff became expensive or rare, the weavers scanted, substituted, took all sorts of shortcuts, and they did this to preserve their livelihoods. In this way, objects testify to worker agency, and none so eloquently as textiles. This is especially important because there are so few written texts left by craftspeople. Close-looking analysis, taking objects on their own terms, allows us to tell history from perspectives that are otherwise absent from the sources, and certainly absent from the written sources. We write history this way from the bottom up, rather than the palace down or the center out. Textiles also open other discussions, moving art history beyond the visual. This is a cover or a blanket made of goat's wool, mohair, soft mohair, camlet in English. And it returns us also to a discussion of technology and its transfer, and also migration, in this case of people, technology, and terminology as well. So this is a kind of fiber. It's actually the undercoat of a special type of goat that lived sort of around the city of Ankara, so Angora, the Angora goat. Sources suggest that these goats could not leave the region, or the quality of the fiber would deteriorate. There was something apparently about the steppe climate and the goat's diet there that made the undercoat super fine, but also very long and correspondingly strong. The fineness and apparently the slipperiness of the fiber also made it difficult to work with. The Dutch, who were deeply involved in the camlet trade in Ankara to Amsterdam, they tried to export prepared warps for weaving, but were unable actually to work with them, meaning that anyone who wanted camlet obtained it already woven from Ankara and the surrounding towns, at least between about 1450 and 1700. So here, this is a cover. It's made of a textile type known as Valenze. So Valenze is a toponym. Some of you will have heard it. This is Valencia. And this is a term that's part of a wool-related vocabulary that arrived in the Ottoman Empire with another large-scale migration, the Jewish men and women who were expelled from Iberia and Southern Europe over the decade following 1492. Now, these communities were not directly involved in the Angora trade, but were rather centered in Salonika, where they wove wool broadcloth. They brought from Iberia to Salonika a type of textile finishing process, in fact, which uses hydraulically powered trip hammers to full wool fabric. This means raising a nap that could be brushed to give a smooth surface effects to the textile, and also made it more water resistant. So this finishing process what's called batanero, clearly Spanish or Ladino, but it gives us bataniye in Ottoman Turkish, or blanket, actually. So the wool broadcloth from Salonika, it doesn't survive so well. It was probably sheep's wool, but it links with Valenze not only in its linguistic origins, but in this particular rectangular format, which was sometimes known indeed as a bataniye. So traveling terms are also ecumenical in their origins. So a point to make here, and at the risk of repeating myself, and especially to an audience that is already globally inclined, textiles and technologies and material travel on non-national trajectories. And a second point, really aimed at those of you who are art historians, camlet was as expensive as a sort of heavyweight figured compound silk. It could and did substitute for it. For this reason, conversations about luxury goods need to look beyond silks with beautiful designs, so not just pattern and motif. Textiles as objects merit consideration for their material and sensory qualities, rather than those that are just visual or decorative, right? I think we all wish we could reach right through the screen to touch this. So, studying textiles means also considering then how they were used. These are two pieces of a type of fabric called beledi. It's a cotton balanced tabby double weave. These are made in a couple of different versions around the Eastern Mediterranean. They're often blue and white. They often use geometric designs that suit the fact that this is a balanced weave and also a tabby weave, and also has a very low thread count. Beledies were woven on smaller, simpler looms than those used for the velvets we just saw, and archival sources, like these inventory lists, tell us that the beledi type was made into a bunch of different kinds of stuff, household furnishings, right, as well as clothing, including clothing used by dervishes or mystics. And it was relatively inexpensive. So in the upper image here, we have a banner, or part of a banner really, part of a banner, and then a smaller piece. We're less clear on what this was. And these are preserved in the Mevlana Museum in Konya. So the Mevlana Museum, formerly the shrine to the mystical poet Jalaluddin Rumi, known as Mevlana. Both of these pieces have inscriptions in Kufic script. One repeats Allah and Muhammad, and the other repeats an imprecation looking more or less like part of the Shahada, or declaration of faith. The banner may have been used in parades or ceremonies of the guilds. So in the 17th or 18th century, some of these guilds retained a bit of the quasi-military, quasi-spiritual ethos that had characterized them in early periods. So groups of workers or guilds, including weavers, also brotherhoods united by faith, at least in some cases, at some points. So blue and white, beledi, cotton cloth, with simple designs, pious phrases, are also part of the history of Ottoman textiles. They're also part of art history, even though they're not opulent silks or even really expensive camlet. Instead, here, simplicity, or perhaps humbleness, is their virtue. The use of these somewhat roughly woven blue cottons with these pious imprecations by a guild or by a dervish is absolutely part of the same landscape in which the elites robed themselves in crimson velvet. The banner, the clothes, their use as much as production affirm a place in the empire and in its social and religious hierarchies for guildsmen, workers, and artisans. Banners such as these, or similar humble garments, broadcast piety and humility, also asserting the right of those carrying them, wearing them, to exist alongside the more powerful or more elite. And by studying them, we also acknowledge the existence of the 99%, or at least some portion of it. We'll now move into the first decades of the 18th century. Yes, what you see here are documents. And the 18th century is really sort of terra incognita for Ottoman textiles and really most other arts too. The exception being architecture. In the 1720s especially, there's a moment of excitement in Constantinople with new building on the part of the elite and with new architectural decoration as well. Sometimes this newness is confused with Westernization, and sometimes it is also seen, and this is a problem, as the beginning of the end for Ottoman art, and really for the Ottoman Empire itself, which nonetheless perseveres for another 200 odd years. So let me take this on a little. So in textiles, as in architecture, there are changes, and some of them are indeed initiated by the palace and its ministers and represented in text. In 1703, a wool weaving workshop was founded in the imperial shipyards. This is Constantinople. In 1720, a silk weaving workshop was added. And what you're seeing here is a folio from a ledger, 2 folios from a ledger that list equipment purchased for this workshop, which was managed by 2 Greek weavers from the island of Chios. In the same ledger, a few pages later, a list of completed textiles coming off the looms. They're almost all of a type called hitaya, which is a lightweight silk textile, much different than the heavy velvet or brocade of earlier centuries. In this list, the scribe has once in a while given a color, white, green, and purple, most often, never crimson. Sometimes the scribe has added a brief description of the pattern, and often the term he uses is dallı, meaning with small floral motifs. And sometimes he uses the term pullu, with small gold motifs. So most of this fabric coming out of these workshops was probably consumed by the Sultan and his family and his retinue, but the surplus was sold at shops in the Grand Bazaar. So these kinds of lightweight fabrics, whether all silk or a combination of silk and cotton with these small floral or gold motifs, was used most often for clothing. It didn't work well for upholstery because it was lightweight, and for the same reason, it really did suit new types of garments worn by women in the capital. And this is a picture by the Ottoman artist Abdülcelil Levni. It's a bit of a fashion plate. Really, surely this is an elite woman, and she is wearing layers and layers of fabric. So a lightweight purple silk figured with small floral motifs over this yellow gold tunic with yet more flowers and striped trousers. Also a layer of almost transparent cloth in between, possibly muslin from India or a local fine silk. Note also decorative belts as well as a sash with floral decoration at the ends. And her headgear, a type of sort of asymmetrical turban-like veil known as a hotoz, also identifies her as a woman of fashion. So lightweight fabrics, often used in clothing, don't survive very well, in part because they're relatively thinner than heavy compound silks. They don't stand up so well to wear. And art historians really have often understood them as being inferior to heavy brocades, right? Gone is that crimson and gold and the bold motif. And in this way, textiles too become part of this narrative of decline, less opulent, not so technically accomplished, no longer partaking in the shared glory of European art. But the lightweight textiles are small motifs. They're totally suited to the new fashions, which themselves are encouraged by newly popular materialities, thin fabrics that allow for multiple layers, and also for this sort of straining at the fastenings look that Levni has represented in this picture. Absolutely not possible with velvet or brocade that was made stiff with lots of metal thread, and in turn make for massive and bulky silhouettes. So Along with my argument about not decline comes also not westernizing. Ottoman textiles in the late 17th and 18th century don't look to Europe, but to India for new styles, as well as to objects circulating around the globe. These new kinds of fabrics, made in the imperial workshops and elsewhere, actually take their names from other places. So Hittaya comes from, of course, Cathay or China, a textile called garam masud, a mix of cotton and silk with small flowered motifs, was made in India, maybe in a place called Garam Masad in Gujarat, but Ottoman weavers began making their own version in the late 1600s. This locally woven Indian fabric was much less expensive than the stuff that was actually imported. Weavers of Chatma cushions also responded to new styles. So shimmering pale grounds, enriched with gold and silver threads, with brilliant blossoms, sometimes in tidy rows. So a thick kind of upholstery fabric, but in a new style, an elaboration on an Indian style, but with exactly the same kinds of weave structures that we saw in earlier centuries with the crimson and gold versions. And also not decline, because objects show us high quality production as well. So this is a giant Chatma floor covering in the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon. And really, it is so big that it was really tough to get out and study, never mind to photograph. So extra thanks here to the curators in Lisbon and to the team of conservators and technicians and photographer who made these images possible. Mr. Gulbenkian of the museum bought the carpet from an Austrian family in 1926. His intermediary, a man named Isbirian, referred to it as an excellent example of the Ottoman Indian type. Isbirian is being purposefully vague, I think. He's not quite risking saying it was one or the other. Note again the shimmering ground, the small plant forms, and also in particular, can you follow my mouse, this sort of lattice-like form in which the plants are placed, characteristic of Indian textiles and carpets especially. Certainly not found in other earlier examples of Chatma, though again, the weave structure and materials show us it was made in the empire. In Chatma cushion covers, there are new kinds of blossoms as well. So if you follow my mouse, we have these incredible sort of full-cupped roses, and the spandrels up here, these attenuated tulips, probably Tulip acuminata. So a real floral fantasy springing from a single vase and crowned with what's really an unmistakable Fritillaria imperialis. Opulent, to be sure, right? Lots of silk and gold, though evidence from the archives from these estate inventories suggests that this type, Chatma cushion cover, remained relatively affordable to the upper elites. In terms of its visuals, it owes much to Chinese trade textiles and to Indian textiles as well. In its palette, in this sort of tree of lifelike fantasia, and in its individual motifs as well. Now, of course, there is more to say about new motifs and formats and palettes. There are links perhaps to design workshops, indeed, in and around the palace, maybe to kilns making decoration, ceramic decoration for the new architecture in Constantinople. This is a ceramic panel that's on the left, probably glazed and fired at a workshop known as Tekfursaray near the old city walls in the capital. So links to arts of the palace, but there are also links to other places outside the palace, outside the empire even, to other kinds of figured silks, namely the so-called Giadinier Velvet type, seen here in an example from Genoa. Note, again, the fritillaria and the vase. This is a way of saying, in part, that weavers and workers don't always take their inspiration from drawings on paper or even ceramics, but from other textiles. Colors, textures, material, drape, shimmer, and shine make them powerful objects worthy of emulation and elaboration. Textiles also travel farther and more intact. They last longer than most other types of objects, including paper. So, with this idea about textiles as their own type of objects, I will actually begin to wrap up. And this is a detail of a silk hanging that was woven in Constantinople, but destined for use in the city of Medina. The Ottoman sultans, as protectors of the holy sanctuaries, had the prerogative of sending covers, curtains, hangings, and the like to clothe monuments there. Some of these textile furnishings were renewed annually during the Hajj, some on a more irregular basis. So this is a silk hanging. It's in a format by this time that was already quite old. The Ottoman versions of this, that's what we're seeing here from the 17th century, were probably modeled on Mamluk antecedents. So probably the format dates to the 15th century, if not earlier. Zigzags with calligraphy, right? Calligraphy being monumental here, really easy to identify, verses from the Quran, in fact. So when the hangings were replaced, the old ones were actually cut up into pieces. And some of the pieces were given to prominent members of the community or the Ottoman administration. Some of the pieces, though, were sold, and the profits from the sales supported the shrines and their maintenance. So this is how we usually see this textile. This is the way it's usually published, if it's really published at all. Focus on the visuals, right? Making clear how it's formatted, how it repeats. These strong lines, the sharp color contrast, the bold calligraphic style, all of these visible visual qualities. But this, of course, is the whole object. So textiles should be reconsidered, also forefronting their sensory qualities and their ability to transform, as here, from a bolt of silk to a hanging used in Arabia, to a coat used in Constantinople. Our silk coat bears witness to personal devotion and also to a somatic sensory experience. We see wear marks around the neck, shoulders, and seams. It suggests it was worn. So was this protective? Was it apotropaic? It had, as a hanging, one assumes, absorbed the prayers of the faithful in Medina before it was brought back to Constantinople. So with this, we get frameworks of piety and belief placed on the body, reminding maybe its user of the Hajj, whether experienced, remembered, or merely yearned for. Considered on their own terms, too, textiles are expressive. So to suggest that this coat, with inscriptions rather than pictures, made of silk, not paint, to suggest that has less to say than a painting or a picture or a statue is as incorrect as it is retrograde. The coat makes a statement far more public and accessible than pictures found in the books of the time, and far more likely to be legible to far more people. A visual component, to be sure, but one that also works alongside its haptic and somatic nature. So, like 3 more words about textiles as a category, 3 more points, right? It is really difficult to imagine sitting here in 2021, we're post-industrial revolution, we're in a fast fashion world. It is hard to believe that the cost of textiles was high, but their ability to signify was also proportionately high. Right? This is big business. Textiles are ubiquitous in terms of commodity, but they're also experienced on a personal level in their century, sort of in their part of their sensory nature. And as more of us, I think, including tonight, right, experience art and art history on screens, there is an increasing need to sort of activate our imaginations and to rewrite textiles in all their peculiarities into our understanding of the past. And this study, I think, opens up the study of textiles generally, opens up new potentials for interdisciplinarity, right? From environmental history to anthropology and to the history of technology, art history to engineering and material science, to human geography as well. And that's, of course, a tall order, but it does suggest what we can begin to do. The study of textiles, of course, is not also undertaken without a lot of goodwill and specialist help in collections and museums, which I am grateful to have had in abundance. So both initial research and publication made possible really by an equally huge array of funders whom I thank here. And I thank also, last of all, you, the audience, for bearing with me. Thank you for coming. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda, for that really fascinating tour of Ottoman, I should put it in inverted commas, textiles. I learned a lot. We're going to take questions now. So if you would like a question, to make a question or pose a question, I should say, could you put it in the chat? I will start off with one. I was very interested when you were talking about the influences of Indian styles and Indian ornament. And I wondered what the impetus was for the adoption of these Indian designs, and also was there a difference in the technical side of the weave between the Indian textile and the Ottoman, the Ottoman production, if you like?
So that's a very large question.
It is,
Alice.
yes. Sorry,
But
yes.
I will try to confine myself
Yes,
a little bit. So right now, and some of you will know this as well as I do, if not better, right? There has been massive import of Indian textiles into the Mediterranean since so far before the Ottoman Empire.
Mhm.
If we think of some of the printed cottons, especially that come out of Fustat and some of the other sites near Cairo and along the Red Sea. So if we think about Gujarat as a major place of production, printed cotton being actually super hard to achieve in as a textile. And so massive demand for it in Cairo and in other places too. So that's say starting as early as probably the 700s and lasting into the Ottoman period. There are also, and this is much less well known, at least a few silks that make their way to from India into the Mediterranean too. So this is longue durée. Absolutely. Ruth Barnes has worked mostly on this, and she's mapped some changes in the styles of these printed cottons. So again, moving some of her work moves into the 16th and 17th century. So Indian textiles were always present. We also know this from customs ledgers too, published in part by Halil Inalcik. Some of you, again, it's one of the best examples, and some of you, again, will know this better than I do, that Mahmud Gavan, a minister of one of the Deccan sultans, sent agents to Bursa to trade silk. So there's the big trade. But what seems to happen, and I think it's probably 17th century, is that a particular style, and I'm using India here, I think perhaps a little sloppily, there is an incredibly powerful style or influential style, do I want to use this word? There's a style that becomes very popular sort of around the world. And so we're entering sort of interwoven globe territory here. It participates in part of the global Baroque, absolutely. Some of these are silks. Some of these are coming from the workshops in Surat or Ahmedabad that are founded by Akbar and are part of a court style for this reason. But they're also interacting with Chinese export textiles at this point. So it is this new style that in part the Ottomans react to. The evidence comes for the Ottomans from the 18th century. This may be an archival fallacy because we're sort of missing records, perhaps, from the second half of the 17th century. So there's one part of it. And then we also have cottons themselves, which are so popular and also difficult to imitate, and their increasing popularity. And then at the same time, in terms of actual fabric type, these new lighter weight fabrics, which seem to gain currency in maybe the late 17th and early 18th century, they've been popular before, but they seem to achieve new popularity. They're made in the court workshops. After all, does this have to do also with clothing and clothing for women in particular? Perhaps at the upper level of the market, certainly. In terms of weave structure, for the velvets, yeah, the Ottoman ones remain Ottoman in terms of their technologies and are completely distinct from those coming from South Asia. Full stop. I know the Ottoman examples. Rahul Jain has published the Indian examples, among other people. Technically, they're different. In terms of weave structures for the lighter weight fabrics, I am less aware of this. I know very little about the Ottoman examples, and they are their own thing, but I only have examples from the 18th and 19th century for that. They are different in their materials from the Indian examples as far as I know.
Right, thank you. Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. We have some questions now on the chat. I'm going to read this out. The Indian connection is fascinating, but I'm curious to know, I'm curious that Iran has been jumped across. So there we go. Is this because of the antagonism between the Safavids and the Ottomans? Nonetheless, it seems odd that all the Safavid textiles, including the amazing figurative silks and velvets, should be so studiously avoided. So
Right.
Asking about the Iran, if there is an Iran connection or if there isn't, why isn't there?
There are a couple of different ways to answer this. So actually, I think we're going to see the publication, I hope, of some more things coming from Iran. And it's not a studious avoidance of Iran in particular. I do think Iran is incredibly influential. I don't like that word. I think that there are styles in Iran in the 17th century, especially, that do make themselves felt both toward the Ottoman Empire and toward India as well. There are excellent records of Safavid weavers going to India to train velvet weavers there. This is a big deal. I left it out in this talk. Is it absent from the book in particular? Maybe a little bit. I think when most of us consider Safavid silks, we're really thinking of those with the arts of the book, right? Our Safavid silks that depict figures in a landscape or depict the Georgian prisoners, for instance. Those are absolutely important in the history of textiles. Are they especially important in the history of Ottoman textiles? Possibly not, actually. If there is excellent evidence that Safavid textiles all through the centuries did come into the Ottoman Empire as much as Indian textiles, perhaps, but we know less about them in a funny way too. The 18th century for Iran especially is quite poorly understood. And I think actually I will leave it there. In fact, I could say too, I mean, if one is feeling like I rather neglected the Persians, there is such good evidence already, I think well published, not necessarily by me, of Persian weavers staffing the palace workshops in the first part of the 16th century as well, and surely bringing with them designs, knowledge of materials and technologies too.
Right, now I have a question from Jake. Pertaining to India, he encountered a reference to chitari in an Ottoman source as a name for realgar, arsenic red pigment. Apparently, this is also the name of a type of striped cloth, originally made in India, but later imitated in Turkey. Have you any idea how it might relate to arsenic red?
A very particular question from Jake Benson. I am not totally surprised. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a textile type that's made in India, in the Ottoman Empire, also in Persia too, probably in Syria as well. So names of textiles, they are sometimes connected with materials and sometimes they are not. From what I understand, yes, it is striped, absolutely. Is it often red or sometimes red? I don't know. What I can tell you is there have been no studies that I know that have found arsenic red in textiles. That being said, there are only a tiny number of dye analyses done for, even for the silks, never mind for cottons, and that's what chitari was.
Mm-hmm. Right, we have another congratulations to you, Amanda, on your wonderful research and your new book. This is from Jessica, and your talk today that moved effortlessly across objects, time and space. A clear sign of in-depth research, and I agree with all those sentiments. Now, she has a question. If you think of our best 16th century velvets in the Gulbenkian and compare them to our later velvets, like the carpet you showed today, are they comparable in terms of value per size, all right? Or is the later production cheaper?
Right.
You see it?
Yeah, I'm looking at that and trying to figure out how to answer that. So price data on this, I have tried to reconstruct. Some of you have heard me try to talk about the differences between velvets that use a lot of pile in the silk and those that use these sort of brocaded grounds. So velvet pile, so those crimson and gold ones, to make the velvet pile, you need a huge amount of silk to get it to those 3D little tufts. So that's why velvet in part is so expensive. So proportionally, maybe those with the grounds that are flat and not piles might be considered to be less expensive. But I think there's reason to be cautious about that. In terms of price, it depends on what we're talking about. Is it price of the materials or price of the finished goods? These things actually don't always line up perfectly. For the Gulbenkian collection, right, we have extraordinarily beautiful 16th century velvets. I assume those are going to be expensive, but something like that giant carpet, which is a unicum, absolutely must have been colossally expensive. I just don't see how it couldn't have been. First of all, in terms of materials, I mean, size, yes. The bigger something is, the more expensive it's going to be, full stop. Absolutely. And then also in workmanship, we don't tend to think that labor in terms of either weaving or designing is all that well paid, but that textile is also incredibly unusual in the way it resolves its corners. So there was, I think, extra level of expertise there as well. So I would not say later production in this case is cheaper. I would say also too, though, that there are through the centuries always different grades of things coming off rather similar looms. So from both written sources and looking at the objects, it is so clear that there's sort of excellent production and then sort of more mediocre production as well, presumably aimed at different levels of the market. And I would say that was a characteristic going back to 1500, right? It's not that we sort of start at this peak of production and then slowly decline into the 18th and 19th century. It is much less clear than that.
Thank you. We have another question which is about the production process and producers. Are there any written records regarding the production process of textiles written by Ottoman producers? in connection with that, you mentioned various groups migrating from different places, dealing with textile production, such as the Ҫaŭonican Jews. Is it possible to identify these producers in the sources?
I think I can also see this happily because I'm going to need to answer this in a couple of different ways, right? So written by Ottoman producers. So that means we're talking about the silk dyers and the spinners and also the weavers. And the answer is none that have been discovered for the central Ottoman case. That said, my excellent colleague, Christina Richardson in New York, is meant to publish, I'm not sure it's out yet, the diary of a weaver from Aleppo, circa, I think, 1600. And this is a source that's going to be super interesting. I hope it's going to sort of result in a whole new way of thinking about the way artisans worked and thought about their work as well. That does seem to be a unicum. In the Ottoman sources, of course, we get names here and there in these Sharia court records, but we know very little about any of these people, barely as a class or as a group, and certainly not as individuals. Now, that's coming from the Ottoman sources. It should also be said, of course, that the Ottoman sources do not represent everybody in the Ottoman Empire. So, for instance, in Salonika and elsewhere in Thrace, the Jewish communities who are in charge of wool weavings left different kinds of records. Absolutely. They were also enjoined by their community leaders not to use the Sharia courts. So they are not represented there. So Ladino language literature has been used in the past to reconstruct some of the conditions, again, of wool weaving in the communities there. I'm less aware of individual artisans too. So biography of individuals, quite difficult. We sort of, a lot of people working in Ottoman history, I'm sure you know, are sort of prosopographical studies. So working out what sort of different classes and groups and people generally in the Ottoman Empire were doing, thinking the way they thought about their work.
Okay, thank you. We've just got a comment here about 18th and 19th century Iranian fabrics, saying they're similar to the contemporary Ottoman trend. And there was also great interest in South Asian patterns and techniques in cotton prints, silks, and woolen Kashmiri shawls in Iranian production and consumption. So I have another question. You were talking about the Mahaya, the Angora, and it was just produced in Ankara, I assume. And you mentioned it was quite widely exported in that period. And how widely, is it through the empire or beyond? Yeah.
Oh, right. So let's see. I can refer you immediately. For the 18th century, there's an excellent book, Ismail Hakikadi's book about camlet, trade between the Ottomans and the Dutch in particular, who seem to be heavily involved. Also, by the time it gets to that period, Izmir too, you can imagine the British and the French. And he really traces the sale of camlet sort of starting with finished cloth and moving into, by the 18th century, later 18th century, thread as well, or actual raw fibers. So that's where it was traded in the empire. Yes, through the empire, we have excellent written sources that discuss either soft or mahayar garments. Absolutely. I think super famously, right, we have it in narrative sources that Sultan Suleiman, toward the end of his life, he abjured his gorgeous silk textiles and clothed himself instead in a garment made of green mahayar, or soft, I think is the word used in the source. And people have interpreted that, incredible austerity on the part of the Sultan. And it's definitely a change, but it's definitely not austere. Really good soft or mahayar cost as much. It costs more, actually, than a really heavyweight, crimson velvet or brocade. Yeah, so through the empire and beyond. In the early period, too, Italian agents in and around Ankara and Bursa were attempting to get their hands on it, big pieces to send back to their patrons in Italy, too.
Thank you. there's another question, and I hope I can read it out correctly. I'd like to know, in this interdisciplinary methodology that you introduce, do you consider the role of the similarity in the written text or language in general, the so-called Persianate world, in the adaptability of the textiles? Do you see what the question's asking? I think.
Is it about syntax somehow?
I don't know. If Zainab's there, perhaps she would like to. I can unmute you.
That one.
Yeah.
Oh, I do see that.
Do you see it? Yeah. Perhaps she could elaborate on that, and I will unmute you. I can't find her. Maybe Matty could unmute. Is she there? Oh, just see if I can find
Actually, maybe I'll take a stab at it just for the fun of it. This is
Right.
I mean, we are now venturing into the sort of deepest thickets of speculation here, right? So for some of the Ottoman textiles, I would say, and now I'm going to talk about the ones really with the patterns, for instance, coming out of, workshops that are maybe associated with the court or use a typical Ottoman style. For Ottoman textiles of this type in particular, we just talk so much about variations on a theme. We get, the sort of same medallions, same rosebuds, same carnations repeated over and over again in all of these different iterations, right? And people have been a little bit skeptical about that. You see one, you see them all, it does is combine and recombine, but right? This was considered a virtue, and this was considered a virtue across a number of Ottoman arts and cultural production, and I would include literature in that as well, right? It's not the shock of the new, certainly, it's how you can refine best on something that already exists. So that's not about interdisciplinary methodology, perhaps, but I think it is one way of thinking about textiles sort of in a larger Ottoman mindset, if you will, for certain types in certain periods.
Okay, and thank you. I think you've answered that very well. Right, Amanda, this is from Scott. Where do you think the Studenica banner was made?
Yeah, so Scott, I did dodge the question. And I'm going to do that annoying thing that academics do, and I'm going to tell you, it's not where it was made, right? This is the wrong question to ask. It's about who it was made by whom it was made, right? So I dodge the question a little bit in the book too. I suggest Bursa, actually. So this was an Ottoman capital in Western Anatolia. It became a huge terminus on the Silk Road. It had massive trade in silk. It had all of these buildings erected by the sultans to encourage the silk trade. We have, I think, a single narrative source from 1396. So this was right around when the textile would have been made, attesting that compound silks were made in Bursa. So there was silk weaving by then at that point there. So what better place to weave a silk for the Sultan than the Sultan's capital of Bursa? This is where Bayezid built a major mosque as well. And it's also the place where we have the only other sort of surviving thing from his reign. It's a minbar at his mosque, which uses an inscription too. So I make a case for Bursa. But who was working there exactly? As far as we understand, there was no sort of continuation of Byzantine weaving traditions, although Bursa as a city would have been majority Greek. So people were coming to Bursa from all sorts of different places. There had already been major shifting in the Armenian kingdoms of Cilicia because of sort of the trouble with the Mamluks, if you will. So displacement. There is also very clear written evidence that populations from the Morea, so the Peloponnese, were marched by Bayezid to Bursa, and weaving had gone on in the Peloponnese, compound weaving in a way it hadn't in Anatolia. So these people also maybe brought weaving with them as well. So who was working there? Open question. Greeks, Armenians, Muslims, Italians by a few centuries later as well. Does this also begin to explain the fact that the calligraphy is not overwhelmingly awesome? The fact that Bursa was still a little bit of an outpost as well. I would add too, somebody had suggested to me Aleppo for this, and I wouldn't totally rule this out either. Until we can sort of establish some more comparanda, I think we are going to sort of be left a little bit, and I think quite sensibly uncertain.
Right. I think that's a very good place to stop where we began tonight. Right. And you must be exhausted. But thank you so much for the talk. You have lots of great, fascinating talk. All of these comments coming through. Great talk. Thank you. And I think everyone enjoyed it really very much. And it was very interesting looking at the different types of textile with you, and also I think the other things of how things drive fashion with the light silks being allowed, you know, people were able to wear lots of different layers, and yes, it was very interesting. And of course the Indian connection, which there are some comments of course in the chat. I think Matty will preserve some of those for you. So thank you very much, Amanda. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And I hope that you will join us again. So thank you. And congratulations on the book. And I really look forward to reading it when it comes out on June the 23rd, as I saw on Amazon this evening. Okay, thank you.